I think what Hamas did is disgusting. I cry for those Israeli innocent civilians. But do I see you guys crying for Palestinians? I mean, Chris Christie was just on here treating it like it's no big deal because what, Palestinian lives don't matter? I think the real bigotry here is saying that Palestinians, we can kill 3 times as many of them already. And this is the appetizer. Netanyahu and his barbaric government have not even started the entree of murder and death and mayhem they're about to do. And that's somehow okay, killing 3 times as many Palestinian civilians, let alone the occupation, which is bigotry by definition. We say that everyone in the world can defend themselves, can have their own state, can have sovereignty, except the Palestinians. And the reasoning behind that is the Palestinians are what? They're what? And the idea is that they are savages and that Muslims are too violent and cannot control themselves, so they must be occupied for 56 brutal, disgusting years. So I've had enough of the bigotry against Muslims and Palestinians, and I need you to speak out against that instead of covering every outrageous, atrocious action of the right-wing government of Israel and going, oh, it's anti-Semitism. No, and there is global anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism here in this country. 2 synagogues were shot up, Pittsburgh and in Southern California. We fight against that all the time. But then whenever Israel is criticized, people go, oh no, it's anti-Semitism. No, there's real anti-Semitism.
Okay. No, but what is happening right now, brother, and let us be honest, if there were a Palestinian occupation of Jews, if Jews were in Gaza and Palestinians cut off water, food, electricity, bombing and killed 2,300 precious Jewish babies, which side would the American government be on? Which side would the American press be on? It would be completely different. I try to be morally consistent and say, I'm against the Palestinian occupation of Jews because Jews are precious. I'm against an Israeli occupation of Palestinians because Palestinians are precious. But when you flip that other way, all of a sudden it becomes very clear that the Palestinian lives really don't count in the way that Jewish lives do for the American government. And that's what I will never succumb to. Why? Because I'm trying to be a decent human being, and also, as you know, as a Christian, each one of those precious human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, and I'm going to stay in contact with the humanity of each, and I'm going to be critical, and I'm going to condemn any group that kills innocent people. Those are war crimes, my brother.
Yes.
You said it is not okay for Israel to attack civilians, attack civilian infrastructure, to threaten to starve the people of Gaza. It most certainly isn't okay. It's a war crime. The Israeli government have brazenly, publicly, and openly declared their intention to commit a war crime and have commenced that war crime against the people of Gaza, saying that they intend to starve of food, electricity, water, 2.2 million people. That is a war crime under the 4th Geneva Convention. They are raining down thousands of the most sophisticated missiles known to humanity onto the most densely populated area in the world, carrying the certainty that almost every missile will incur civilian casualties, will and are destroying the infrastructure, the water infrastructure, the energy, making Gaza uninhabitable, and using, in very credible reports, as they did in the past, chemical weapons, white phosphorus, being used by Israel. And you try to suggest there is some symmetry, some equivalence between the actions of Hamas and what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians for decades. Will you admit that the terrible loss of life and escalation of violence that we have seen in the last few days is simply a continuation of the crimes against humanity, the war crimes of the state of Israel against the people of Palestine? And it's not me saying this. You have, or you should have read, the reports of Amnesty International, which we asked you to read and act on Human Rights Watch, on the UN Special Rapporteur to Palestine, on the UN Human Rights Council, on the issue of Palestine. Do you know that the Israeli state will not even allow the UN Rapporteur on Palestine into the occupied territories, or the UN Human Rights Council in, because they know that they will bear witness to the ongoing ethnic cleansing, the ongoing illegal annexation of territory, the ongoing arbitrary detention of Palestinians without trial, the impunity when they assassinate a journalist like Shireen Abu Akleh. No justice, no sanctions. What do we actually get? The head of the most powerful state in the world, while Israel is threatening to commit war crimes against Israel, says we're going to give them more weapons and arms. We support them absolutely. So will you admit that the ultimate responsibility for the terrible, and every single loss of life is terrible, but is the failure of the United States, of the European Union, of the Western powers to hold to account Israel for ongoing, decades-long ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the denial of the most basic rights to the Palestinian people? As Gideon Levy said, Israel, a Jewish Israeli columnist, said yesterday, Israel can't imprison 2 million Gazans without paying a cruel price. Isn't that the truth?
Deputy, please.
Now, if the Jews were not expelled from Judea, how come that there are so many Jews in the world? The answer is very simple. I don't believe that a lot of you knows that there were at least 4 Jewish kingdoms in the history. Kingdoms. You see, I'm speaking before classes in Tel Aviv University, and before me there are sitting students so colorful, so different in image and in their faces, and they believe that they are descendant of David the king. The nice Jewish Yemenite student with the nice hairs, you know, I would say frisé. They believe that it is the wind from the Red Sea that make it so nice. Nobody knows that it was a Jewish kingdom in the 5th century. They say the same thing in North Africa. Physically, there is not a difference between the Jews from Morocco and a Berberian from Morocco. But they believe that they come from Palestine. The same thing is also with the European Jew. I try to show in my book that Jews in the world, most of them are natives of the places that they were born and lived and developed. A Bulgarian Jew is not different from a Christian Bulgarian. And sometimes, in some places, the people that choose Judaism were before the others that choose Christianism later. You understand me? A lot of places, people that live in this area choose Judaism before other people choose Christianism. It means that a lot of Jews are more autochthon than Christian in this country. I know that the anti-Semitic between you will not like this idea. and not the Zionists between you. Anyway. Most of the Jews of the world, people that consider themselves as Jews, don't want to go to live in Israel. It's okay for my part. I don't feel lonely. But something important, Zionism succeeds better than other nationalism by creating two people. A Palestinian nation, people, in an Israeli nation. Israeli people. Why people? A common language, a literature in Hebrew, a cinema, theater, etc., etc., etc. But Zionism don't want to recognize that it is his child. It's a bastard child. You understand? This is the danger of the existence of Israel today. Because Israel, and Bibi Netanyahu express it every week, say that the state of Israel is not the state of its citizens. But 25% of the Israeli citizens, without the occupied territories, are not considered the Minister of Interior as Jews. 20% are Arab. 5% are immigrants from Russia, not Jews. In basic, the state doesn't belong to them. Bibi Netanyahu is sure that the Israeli state belongs much more to the Jews in Sofia than to my pupils, students in the Tel Aviv University. They are not Jews, Arabs. I have Arabs students, Israeli. They are speaking Hebrew better than me. I want you, please, think about it if you are not against Israel. Israel has not a future if it will continue to be the state of Woody Allen and not of my students. Not because Woody Allen is not serious. He doesn't want to live with me in Israel, in Tel Aviv. Okay, I want good relationship with Woody Allen. The next generation of Woody Allen will not be Jew. It is not a problem for me. But I'm really worried that Jewish nationalism was not transformed to a civic nationalism, instead an ethnocentric nationalism. This is the problem of Israel, that Jewish nationalism, it means Zionism, didn't change to a civic nationalism, civil, and continue to stay ethnocentric. You understand me? I'm afraid of a Kosovo and Galilee. The Arabs, the Israeli citizens, Arabs, are majority in the Galilee today. If tomorrow they will do like the Kosovar, as you know, the Kosovar are Albanian, they don't want to belong to Albania. Everybody knows it. Sorry if there is a Kosovar, you are a Kosovar. Sorry, yeah, you are a Kosovar? Anyway, I'm for the Kosovar. There is not a problem. The fact that they are Albanians doesn't mean that they want to be a part of Albania, that it's much more poorer. The Palestinians in the Galilee, most of them don't want to belong to Palestine, to the occupied territories. They are Israeli citizens. They are speaking the two languages perfectly. But Israel said that it's a Jewish state, not the Israeli Republic. This is the reason that I wrote my book, to say that Israel is not a real democracy. It's continued to be much more an ethnocracy. Thank you very much.
Last time we showed that neither Jesus nor his earliest followers were Christians. We saw why we really shouldn't use the word Christian for anyone or anything earlier than about 300 Common Era. As far as what Christianity is today, we owe it all to Constantine. Our churches, our liturgies, the stuff we wear at liturgy, stuff we do. All the familiar stuff. It all comes from the time of Constantine. So then what should we call earlier believers? You know, people from the First and New Testaments. Okay, so let's go back in time to around 1800 BCE. This is the time period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What do we call these people? At this time, we find the mysterious Apiru. Sounds a lot like Hebrew. Apiru meant outsiders. They were a wide configuration of nomadic peoples. Sumerians tell of a group of Aramean nomads living in southern Mesopotamia as Apiru. These motley, non-related tribes settled wherever they wanted, and many of them were considered robbers and murderous raiders. So what was Abraham? He was likely Apiru. The Hapiru continue through 1400 BCE and the time of Moses. You know, there are so many layers to the history by later peoples, so many recontextualizations. Unified initially under the short-lived Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms, between 950 and 587 BCE, we encounter Israelites. But the history of ancient Israel is marked throughout with several significant and irreversible changes stemming out from major social alterations. At the end of this time, radical geographical change and displacement occurred, and Israelites were expelled or forced into one-way emigration. Others were forcibly brought into the land via one-way immigration. All of these peoples had little hope of returning to their place of origin. This is the formation of the so-called diaspora. From 520 BCE all the way until 70 Common Era, we have the period of the Judeans. Judeans is the right translation of Yehudim in Hebrew and Judaioi in Greek. Judeans are all those people who lived or originated in what became the Persian colony of Yehud under Persian cultural influence and rule around 500 BCE. During the Persian period, with the formation of the Persian colony of Yahud south of Samaria and the adoption of Persian customs by the various peoples who worshiped the god Yah, third-generation Yahud people, with their temple in Jerusalem, were proud of their Persian origins, as indicated by the adoption of many Persian customs. For instance, their use of esoteric language in their sacred writings, or the idea of the eternal flame in the temple, or belief in angels, and devils. The special role of the Satan. The idea of a garden called paradise. Resurrection belief, where the righteous dead are transformed into stars. As well as by the formation of a Parsi political religious group called Pharisees in the New Testament. And all those old stories about Moses, or even earlier ones about Abraham and his family before, were composed by Persian authorized scribes. For example, Solomon's Temple. Did it ever exist? Folks, it is probably entirely mythical, created by Persian scribes. By the way, this stuff never gets covered by popular speakers and authors like Scott Hahn or Robert Barron. These people present the Bible like it's one big linear timeline of events, like from an epic novel or movie. So what do we call Israelites living in New Testament times? Well, you can never go wrong by calling them Israelites. In fact, the best thing to call them is Israelites. Outsiders to the Roman province of Syro-Palestine living at the same time might have collectively labeled any native from the land of Israel as Judeans, or barbarian Israelites. That is, Israelites who live in the land of Judea, speak the barbarian language Aramaic, and adhere to barbarian customs, like the dietary codes and genital mutilation practices. But what if you were an Israelite living in the land of Israel? Well, then you would distinguish your fellow Israelites regionally or geographically. And in that case, you would consider somebody to be a Judean if he or she lived in the vicinity of Jerusalem. But if they lived around the Sea of Tiberias, you would call them Galileans. And if they lived in the eastern Transjordan, you would call them Pereans. But you know what nobody would call them back then? No one would call them Christians or Jews. None of these people are Christians or Jews. You see, at this time, Pharisees, Sadducees, Jesus group people we could call Messianists, Essenes, and other political religious sects, but there were no Christians or Jews yet. Contrary to widespread spurious belief, Christians and Jews come centuries later on. How did that come about? Well, in order to understand that, we have to see what took place in the year 70 Common Era, and what happens after 70 Common Era. Try to imagine what a cataclysm the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Romans was for the Judeans. Can you appreciate how earth-shattering that must have been? Israelite faith was all about this temple. It was where you, as an Israelite, went on pilgrimage 3 times a year. The sole place you worshipped, meaning offered sacrifice. This temple is what your faith was all about. This temple was how you did your practice. Now, temple was gone. So what were Israelites going to do? During the Roman destruction of henotheistic Israel's central temple, the center of their life, the center of political religion, new social structures or new social situations emerged. 2 prevailing Israelite groups learned how to breathe underwater. They evolved away from prevailing political religion to newly exclusive fictive kinship religion. Everything got redefined and reshaped. And all those other Judean groups that could not adapt, they went extinct. After 70 Common Era, legendary Pharisee Yochanan ben Zakkai founded the academy at Yabna. Eventually, Rabbinic Judaism sprang from this. And eventually, out of this and further developments, the Talmuds were produced, the Babylonian and the Palestinian. And the Judaism we know today, practiced by Jews, is rooted in Talmudic practices. But the Talmuds come around 500 Common Era, and therefore there are no Jews before at least 500 Common Era. In fact, Jew is a medieval English word inappropriate to describe anything prior to 500 Common Era. Christian, as we saw in a previous video, is inappropriate to apply to anything prior to 325 Common Era. The analogy for the relationship between Jews and Christians, then, is like that between sisters in the womb, not between parent and child. Therefore, at the end of the 1st century, Jesus groups may be thought of as Israel awaiting the theocracy proclaimed by Jesus. And Ben Zakkai's groups may be thought of as Israel awaiting the restoration of the temple. Consider this. Back in 1000 BCE, David's court storyteller, someone called by scripture scholars the Yahwist, combined older Semitic myths and legends, some going way back deep into Apiru times, and made a new story. This new story recontextualized the older myths and legends about the patriarchs, all giving justification for the Davidic kingdom's existence. Folks, please, when you're reading the Bible, don't look for Ancestry.com DNA-accurate bridges between heroes and events, okay? Memories get updated, reshaped, retold. Historically speaking, the Exodus story was invented by Judean scribes 1,000 years later during the Persian period, modeled after their own immigration from Persia. In other words, the relationship between Judeans in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and legendary Abraham the Apiru is mythic. Understanding that helps us a great deal in recognizing the same about how Jews and Christians today relate to New Testament times and groups. Please don't look for Ancestry.com DNA-accurate apostolic succession links when you're reading Matthew chapter 16 or John chapter 21. And in the same way, don't look for that between Jews and ancient biblical peoples either. The genocidal hatred Christians have perennially unleashed against Jews is not only horrendously evil, the theological justifications used repeatedly to excuse pogroms, expulsions, and even worse atrocities committed against Jewish people are also absurd. There were no Jews existing in Jesus' day and for centuries afterward. How can we then blame Jews for rejecting him or crucifying him? Not only would doing that be evil, it would be ridiculous. The same thing goes for theological justifications fundamentalist Christians use for racist Zionism and its genocidal actions against Palestinians. Imagine the following scene from the Gospel called Luke. Jesus is giving a sermon in the synagogue. How do you picture it? Is Jesus behaving like a modern Jewish rabbi? Is he wearing a kippah, what later Yiddish culture will call a yarmulke? Perhaps you've been to service at a local Jewish synagogue. Do you think what is going on in Luke chapter 4 is like that? If so, think again, because if you imagine it that way, you are being grossly anachronistic. It wasn't like that at all. Language does not acquire meaning from lexica, dictionaries, or etymologies. Instead, all language, including biblical language, derives its meaning from the social system. We 21st century Westerners belong to an extremely different social system than that of biblical peoples. And we Western 21st century people indeed know Jews and Jewish beliefs and Jewish practices. But Jewish scholars like Shia Cohen and Jacob Neusner remind us that contemporary Jewish beliefs and practices are rooted in the formation of the Talmud. We are talking about the 6th century Common Era. The process of the evolution of the Talmud took centuries and happened after Jesus and the first Jesus groups, probably beginning around 90 Common Era. Some Jewish practices, like the bar mitzvah and especially the bat mitzvah, have no root in the Hebrew Bible or in New Testament times. Both John the Baptist and Jesus were called rabbis. Do you think that they were Jewish rabbis? It wasn't until long after their time that rabbis, as we now know and understand them, and the synagogue as a place of worship began to evolve. In the context of John the Baptist and Jesus, rabbi meant nothing more than a term of respect. It was a respectful, honorable way of addressing a great one, like important teachers. It derives from the Hebrew word rab, meaning Lord or Master. Rabbi today is an official position and title. This developed long after Jesus' day. Scholar Heather McKay has demonstrated convincingly that it was not until long after New Testament times, really not until 200 Common Era, that synagogues became places of worship. Synagogue never means Jewish synagogue whenever encountered in the Bible. In the first century, synagogue is not a place of worship. Think about Paul arguing for 3 weeks in a synagogue. Does that sound like a place of worship? It's more like a hostel or hangout place for Israelite males. There they hung out and did what Mediterranean males do everywhere in their hangout places. Talk, cuss, spit, get into fights, and argue about politics, in this case, the political text called the Torah. Israelite males did not gather there for services because no worship services existed at this time in synagogues. And in the first century, the Sabbath was a day of rest, not a day of worship. The Sabbath became a day of worship, and synagogues evolved to be places of worship when some Israelites reacted to the practice of Messianic Israelites in Palestinian Yahwism, anachronistically called Christians. These Messianists assembled to celebrate the Lord's Supper on the seventh day. A reaction to this caused an evolution. You know, we really should stop thinking of first century Israelites as either Jews or Christians. There were none at that time. As Rosemary Radford Ruther pointed out decades ago, it wasn't until the 4th century that Judaism and Christianity assumed the features by which they are known today. Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin agrees, calling both Judaism and Christianity twins in the womb, developing until their birth in the 4th century. So there really is nothing Jewish or Christian about the New Testament. I mean, you could say the New Testament is Christian in its canonization, but that's about it. There's nothing Jewish or Christian about the New Testament's rabbis or synagogues. The Hebrew word Yehudim and the Greek word Judaioi should be properly translated Judeans, not Jews. The contemporary English word Jew is traced linguistically to the Middle English period. That's around 1200 Common Era. And it derives from the Old French, ultimately back to Latin, Greek, and Hebrew roots. But it is inappropriate as a translation of the Greek and the Hebrew to call Jesus a Jew or a Christian, as these words are understood in the vernacular today, not only confuses the matter historically, but has led to disastrous social and interreligious consequences. Is there really a Judeo-Christian tradition? Many writers today take it for granted that there is. But when we look closely at history, specifically at the Jewish tradition, and the Christian tradition, our spurious familiarity with expressions like Judeo-Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian values, and Judeo-Christian ethics might be in for a shock. The Gospel called Matthew is often imagined to be the most Jewish of all Gospels. Many today see Matthew's Gospel as the starting point of the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. But what if this understanding is wrong, based on anachronistic thinking? What if popular designations such as Judeo-Christian tradition and Judeo-Christian ethics are simply false? According to context group scholars like John Pilch and Bruce Molina, there was nothing Jewish or Christian in the first century Mediterranean world, and surely nothing that might be called a Judeo-Christian tradition. Therefore, we cannot accurately claim that the European monotheism emerging in early Christianity after New Testament times and articulated so well in medieval Christendom was part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the reason being because such a tradition did not exist. Christianity and Judaism, contrary to widespread spurious familiarity, evolved after. Indeed, normative Judaism, hence the distinctively Jewish tradition, does not emerge until at least the late 4th century Common Era. That according to Jewish scholars like Jacob Neusner. The Jewish religion originates at the same time Mediterranean Christian elites, in Constantinian and post-Constantinian times, debated about the relationship of Jesus to God, the so-called Christological controversies. Both traditions, of course, Christian and Jewish, are 5th century outcomes rooted in the post-exilic Israelite world of 1st century Palestine. When it comes to words like Christian and Jewish, the same rule applies. Language only means what it means, where and when you use it. Whether it is words or sentences, whenever you move the language, you necessarily change the meaning. It isn't dictionaries and lexica that provide the meanings to words, folks. Social systems do that. Those evolve and change, and with it, so goes the meaning of language. Because words, like language itself, have their meanings from social systems, Bible translators and interpreters are essentially anachronistic when they assert that the New Testament Greek word Judaios means Jew, and that Judaismos means Judaism in the sense of Jewishness. Actually, Judaios means of or pertaining to Judea, a no longer existing reality. Judaismos means the behavior typical of and particular to those from Judea. Jewishness, and those espousing it, Jewish people or Jews, are a post-4th century phenomenon at the base of the Jewish tradition with its Talmud and rabbinical structure. The fact that people known as Jews today have their kinship religion rooted in the Babylonian Talmud should indicate to us that this form of religion dates back to the Babylonian Talmud in the 5th century Common Era. Furthermore, to develop a Judeo-Christian tradition and Judeo-Christian values and Judeo-Christian ethics, there would have to be a sustainable, positive, traditional Christian interaction with Jews, and vice versa. But any such interaction in any positive, non-hostile, constructive sense that might have formed a Judeo-Christian tradition did not happen until after the 18th century European Enlightenment. Indeed, historically, Christians have brutally persecuted Jews in genocidal hatred. Even today, among professed Christians, there are alarming indications of the hideousness of this growing.
The thing about it, me and Adidas, is like, I could literally say anti-Semitic and they can't drop me. I could say anti-Semitic things and Adidas can't drop me.
Finally, the actual reference to a common Jewish-Christian tradition emerges only in late 19th century Northern Europe, when Jews began to frequent Enlightenment universities. Much development has happened since. Recently, great strides have been made in interreligious dialogue, and this great work needs to continue. But it also needs to be intellectually and historically honest.
You know, lately, in Paris, in London, in New York, people are speaking about the Judeo-Christianity. You heard about it? Civilization. Judeo-Christianity civilization. People like the term. In the first book I wrote that my aunt, didn't know when they pushed her to Auschwitz that one day Europe, the Western world, will define itself as a Judeo-Christian civilization. It's nice, no? There is not a Jewish Christian civilization. There is a Christian civilization that oppressed the Jewishness much more than all other civilizations in history. This is the truth. And this minority became a very tough minority, believing that a chosen people. It was one of the conditions, sine qua non, to stay a Jew, to know that you are a chosen people. You have to understand, Jewish ethics, in my point of view, are not the ethics that I dream of. Why? Because in Jewishness, the ethics is intergroup. You say it in English, intergroup? It's not universalist ethics, you have to understand, much less than Muslims or Christianity. Why? Not only because of the Bible, because it was a minority that suffered from strong power around it, that developed an intergroup ethics. But you don't have, in the Jewish ethics, you don't have a cosmopolitism ethics, universal ethics.
So, what can be said of the prevailing religious tradition, values, and ethics of the United States? Celebrated by so many in spurious familiarity as a Judeo-Christian nation. The fact is that, for better or worse, the prevailing religious tradition of the United States is Euro-Christian, and at its root stands the monotheism facilitated by Roman imperial monarchy, the social structure that served as analogy for this fundamental Christian religious perspective. Holy and absolute mystery called God works in the mess, folks. Therefore, the God once understood in the henotheistic Israelite tradition, with the analogy of an ethnic patron god, Yahweh, for an ethnic chosen people, is seen by Christianity to eventually be revealed in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, a Galilean of the house of Israel, as being the God of all humankind. According to this Christian perspective, developed long after New Testament times, now all humans are actually or potentially God's chosen people. And what about the gospel called Matthew? This first century Messianist Israelite document predates both Jewish tradition and Christian tradition. Apart from later Christian allegorical interpretation of it, Matthew should not be thought of as originating from either tradition, or imagined to be a starting point of a fantastical hybrid. Many people believe that the story of Israel in the Bible is the actual history of Israel, but the historical facts disagree. The reality is that in the Persian Empire of the 5th century BCE, what remained of historical Israel was Samaria. That's right, the only people we can really point to as guaranteed true blood biological descendants of Israelites in the time of Jesus were the Samaritans. Yep. When Judeans insultingly called Galilean Jesus a Samaritan, ironically and in terrible ignorance, they were calling him a genuine Israelite. Funny how things work like that, huh? Judea started off as a Persian colony. Back in the 5th century BCE, that brand new Persian colony of Yehud had been established by the donation of Cyrus. Only a tiny handful of Persian transferred elites governed the Persian colonists and all the surrounding peasants. To really anchor and justify their rule over the population required the invention of a new foundation story. And that explains why and how the Babylonian exile story got shaped. And something else was needed. A set of somewhat familiar older stories, now recontextualized to enable this tiny Persian colonial enclave to establish among the mostly illiterate peasant population their antiquity. They've been here all along. If they could establish the antiquity, they would establish their authority. Colonists and foreigners invading from far-off Persia, taking over? No way! These new elites were not immigrants to Judea. They were returning exiles. They were princes coming home. Good thing for them that reading and writing skills only belong to a precious few. This new set of stories and recontextualize older myths and legends, composed by Persian-authorized elite scribes, resulted in the biblical story of Israel. And it provided the credentials for these Persian colonists, new Judeans, to claim to be the true Israelites.
In fact, we know from Roman texts that people in the Roman world who did become newly rich and wanted to move up the social ladder hired genealogists to create fictive genealogies for themselves. And there were a few stars in the pantheon of Roman ancestors they all wanted to be associated with. For a fee, you could get that association. Now you have the map that tells everybody where you fit in the pecking order of things, and that has an enormous impact on your life.
This kind of political storytelling and inventing the story of a people was nothing new in the land of Israel. 5 centuries earlier, David's retainers and storytellers had done the same thing. When David ascended to the throne, they reworked earlier Semitic myths and legends of Apiru warlords to point to the Davidic kingdom. It was all part of the plan. By the 3rd century BCE, Judea proper was only a tiny part of Palestine. Judea was so small, in fact, you could honestly identify it by pointing at Jerusalem and the tiny region encircling it. That's just how Polybius understands Judea in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. Outside it were Samaria and Galilee. So all Judeans living at the time of Jesus had a relationship with Abraham and the patriarchs, with Moses and King David, that was mythological. That doesn't mean it's not true. It's just not factual. Myth is that which will always be true but never happened. And for the past 2,000 years, different religious groups have continued with mythological links to Father Abraham. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all call Abraham their father. And you know, he is in a mythological sense, but not a biological sense. Some people today, unfortunately, make a terrible mistake. They confuse the story of Israel found in the Bible with the history of Israelites. Even worse, they confuse the biblical story of biblical Israel with contemporary Israeli people. This is a big problem, folks.
You know, we are used to repeat the stupidities of our parents, especially the stories of the national education. You know, all my life I was speaking about Jewish people, Jewish nation. I was always speaking about the Jewish nation. What is a people? What is a nation? What is nationality? What is nationalism? You know, in the last 15 years, more or less, Israeli archaeologues discovered that the exodus of the Jews from Egypt didn't happen. It was a myth. The exodus, you know, the Jews from Egypt, Moses and all this. The archaeologue in Israel discovered that it is a myth, a legend. I remember the day that the first time I heard explanation that, you know, this historical process didn't happen, never happened. And I understood that everything is possible. You understand? Everything is possible with questions, not with answers. I ask you to try to imagine a peasant living 50 kilometers from Sofia 500 years ago. Do you believe that he knows that he is Bulgarian? Really? You thought about it? 500 years ago. They believe that 4,000 years before, people knew that they belonged to a Jewish nation. You understand? To speak about a people in the modern sense of the word, we need some education, general education, a standard language, and you know, a level of communication that is a product only of the last 100 years. You understand me? Then I don't believe that we can use the word people in the modern sense of the term on 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago. And also Jews. didn't exist for 2,000 years ago as a people or as a nation. The problem is, to build nations, you have to imagine back peoples. To create new nations, you have to imagine. It's not enough that you have a common language. It's not enough that you have a political common consciousness. You need to invent yourself to the back, to feel that you are something that is coming from very, very far. This is national identity. It's not enough to live the present. You need a long past. The Bible is not a historical book. Not the First Testament and not the second one. It's a very great theological text. No. I think that Palestinians of today are a mixture. I think that it's a people, a mixed people, like all the people in the world. But the chance that a Palestinian will be a dissident is much greater than me and a lot of Jews that are in this room. Sorry again.